Around 606 BC, we have the Babylonians surrounding the people of Jerusalem and taking away captives. In those number were Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and several other people. There's 3 different invasions of Babylonians until they finally destroyed the temple and the walls and left nothing really there. Took as many people as they could captive. They left a lot of the poor there, but the 70 years of captivity began. And of course, it was prophesied that they would be back in 70 years. And they had 2 or 3 different processes of going back. And in the book of Nehemiah, we have the last process of going back, and it was a lot more than 70 years from the time the Babylonians took over. But Nehemiah went back to build up the walls around Jerusalem. It's kind of the last part of bringing back the culture and the establishment of Jerusalem, and it was a very significant day for them. So there's a lot in the book about his vision, his ability to lead. There's a lot of leadership lessons and principles here. Many times we look at Nehemiah chapter 1, which is what we're going to be looking at tonight. To talk about that, I want you to think about how important it is that we can see, have vision, and not just our eyes, but that we can see spiritually. We can see where we're going. That's important for the elders. It's important for teachers. It's important for all of us individually as members. We need to have a common vision of where we're going. And the only way we're really going to get there is for that vision to be explained and talked about and communicated in the best ways, and that's not always easy to do. Sometimes it's not easy because we don't really know what the vision is. We're talking about where a place that we're going, and we can't see the future, so we have to be able to figure out, okay, what can we do to decide? What can we point at? That's a big part of what we're talking about in the book of Nehemiah. There were definite things that he wanted to have done, and he had definite ideas, and that's part of what it means to have vision. And we can learn a lot about how that works and leadership, how we can also be a part of that, and really the whole book is wonderful for talking about that. It gets into how to handle problems and all kinds of things. We're not going to get into all of that tonight, but we're going to look at the idea of vision. And we first of all need to recognize that we need vision. It's required. There's no other way to go. And if we don't have this, we tend to meander. We kind of wander around, and we don't really have purpose. We understand that. I get this way sometimes myself. If I'm not really, I haven't really been thinking about goals or something I'm trying to achieve or where we're trying to go or what I'm trying to do in my work, all kinds of things. I get down, I get depressed, I start looking around thinking, man, what am I even doing here? And I have to go and separate a little bit, take some time to think, okay, what am I actually trying to accomplish here in my work? And the reason for that is because we all have to have some place we're going. And if we don't, we really aren't going to be able to get there. You know, I think it was Zig Ziglar, someone said something about if you don't set goals, you'll hit them every time. If you don't know where you're going, you're very liable to wind up there. Well, where is there? It's just anywhere. And it could be anything, and it may be bad and it may be good. But think about it for just a minute. How many times have you accidentally did something that worked out that it was actually a good thing? Most of the time, if we are not really focused and working towards something good, the something good doesn't tend to happen for us. Now recognize that God works out all things for good for those who love Him. So I'm not trying to take away from that, but we can look at specific examples in our own lives where we really didn't try to achieve something, and the things that we didn't try to achieve, well, we usually don't hit, right? If we're not looking for a place to go, we may never get there. And so this is what I want to look at tonight. There's 7 principles. I'm going to go through these very quickly so that we don't have to get really bogged down with them. But the first one is we want to have the proper questions. Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, it says, well, I'm going to start in verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hekeliah, It came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. Do you know that one of the most important things we can do is ask the right questions? He was asking appropriate questions to find out the information he needed. He probably did that because he cared about them. He cared about his own people, and he wanted to find information. It's amazing to me sometimes how I don't ask questions. It's not that I don't ask the right questions, it's sometimes I don't ask questions. We make assumptions, or maybe we don't even think about someone else or other things that may be going on, and so we don't ask. But if we are going to accomplish anything, we've got to learn to ask questions and ask good questions based upon the information that we want to get back. It's as simple as it can be, but it's amazing how sometimes we don't think about that simple little thing of asking the right questions. And I tell you what, a good question asked at the right time can do amazing things. This is a very important and very powerful way to teach people as well. Because when you ask someone a question, if they're honest and they're trying to give an answer, they're going to search inside or maybe even search the Word to be able to answer that question, and they're going to learn a lot in the process. You learn a whole lot more from someone asking you a question than simply they just give you an idea. That's one of the reasons that I ask so many questions in Bible classes, because it helps us to think through what the Bible actually says and not just regurgitate what we've always heard. You know, whenever I was growing up, we had classes, many classes I've been to, where we would have group discussion, and there's nothing wrong with doing it, but it's like everywhere I went, we had group discussions and we come to the same book, and all the answers were always the same everywhere I went. Because it's almost like they had a rule book. It's like, these are the words that you're supposed to say when you ask this question. These are the words you're supposed to say when you ask this question. And so what I started doing when I started teaching and started learning how to do it a little bit better, I think, was I started asking questions that were unusual questions, or asking questions where I didn't think I was trying to get something beyond or besides what is normally said. It's not that what was normally said was wrong. It's just that it's easy for us to regurgitate things that we thought. I remember hearing a man talking to a group of teens, and he said, listen, I don't want the typical answer when I ask you this question. He said, do you know what the typical answer is in Bible class? Any question that you ask in Bible class, the answer could almost always come back as Jesus. So when you ask a question in Bible class, you just expect the answer is going to be, well, it's Jesus. Who's the bread of life? That's Jesus. What is the bread of life? That's Jesus. Almost anything you ask, you can get around to saying, well, it's Jesus. Now, he's being a little bit facetious with that, but there's a lot of truth there. We just kind of state the obvious because that's what we've heard everyone else say. But when we start asking questions, and this is a really important idea, not just me asking you questions, but all of us asking questions of the text, this is when we start learning. And this is when we start getting depth of what we see in the Scriptures. So developing vision requires us to ask proper questions. Another one is about this is that in verse 4 is that it requires proper emotions. It says, so it was, after he'd heard about Jerusalem and it's broken down the walls and its gates were burned with fire. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Have you ever been in a situation where something happened and you just didn't know how to respond? You didn't know what you're supposed to feel? You didn't know how you're supposed to react? I've been there a lot, and it's made me question my humanity sometimes, because I'm in a situation, I don't know how to react to the situation. Well, we can learn how to react, and we can learn how we should be reacting, and it kind of goes back to asking proper questions for one, but we can learn it from other people, we can learn it from the Word, and we should recognize that sometimes we have to admit that maybe we need to respond differently than we have been. When we hear bad news, it should affect us. And if it doesn't affect us, then maybe we are to ask why. Or we hear something, someone in the congregation has something good happen to them and they're extremely joyful, and we react in something besides joy. It ought to make us ask questions about, why would this be? Why am I reacting in this way? And so I need to have proper emotions. And it's important for us, it's proper for us to recognize that we ought to have proper emotions. And if we don't have the right emotional responses, then we ought to ask a lot of good questions. What's preventing me from it? What do I actually feel instead? Those are important questions, because if I see someone who is happy and joyous and I feel angry and resentment, then that's showing me something about myself, that perhaps I have something inside of me that's not right. Maybe I have some envy or some jealousy in the situation that I need to work on. So we need to have the proper emotional responses to things whenever we see that we see something is happening, and that's the only way we can have real vision. These are really all, these 7 things we're going to talk about, these are all just ways of seeing reality in the best way that we can. And as human beings, I'm convinced we are masters at hiding reality. We're good at it. We hide it all in all kinds of different ways, and we pretend we pretend what's real is not actually there. So we need to have the proper emotions. We also need to have the proper responses. It's not enough to just have the right emotion. We need to respond appropriately when we do that. That's what he says in verses 4 and 5. Well, in verse 4, we see that he wept and he mourned and he fasted and prayed. See, weeping and mourning, the proper response to weeping and mourning is fasting and prayer. And not only that, look at what he'd said in verse 5. He said, I pray, O Lord, God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. So what did he do? He immediately began to pray and to fast. Do you respond that way? When you see things happen and you see joy, do you take the time to praise God and thank Him for what just happened? There are so many appropriate responses that we should have ingrained within us that sometimes we don't take the time to do. And so having the time to sit and think, the time to sit and meditate on God and what He has done, and to meditate on where you are and where you've been and where you're going, and thinking through those things and how you should respond to the reality that's around you, we need to make sure we have the proper response. And the only way we really can know that is to look at the Word and see what should be my response in this situation. Sometimes it's very difficult to know. An example of this would be 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. When Paul is talking about someone who is in the faith who passes away. What is our proper response? He says not to mourn as those who have no hope. Now, he's not implying by that we can't mourn at all. We just mourn as someone who has hope, right? So we recognize we're not so distraught that we think, everything is terrible, my life has been torn apart. We mourn in a different way. We're not mourning because that person's gone. We're mourning because we miss that person being in our lives. Those are two different ideas. So when we recognize that we're mourning because there's a hole now in my life, we need to recognize that mourning, especially when we have a death in the family, mourning has to do with me, has to do with the person who's living, not with the person who's gone. That person is actually, if he's a Christian, is in a better place than we are. And so it's inappropriate for us to suggest or to wish or to pray about that God would bring them back to us. I saw one time in a funeral that I did this. It was a poem, and I'm not running them down. I understand the sentiment. It was just a sentiment thing is all it was. But imagine if this was literal. The poem said something about the fact that if they could do one thing, that would be to bring that person back down from heaven to be with me. And I thought, how selfish that we would take them from God and have them be with us in our life because we miss them. We mourn, but we don't do it as other people. So we recognize that. We don't have to go around cutting ourselves. There's no reason to be so distraught that we even harm ourselves. There's none of those things are proper responses, and we know that because of the Scripture. So in order to have the proper vision for where we're going, we actually have to have the proper responses to the situations that we're facing. The next one is a proper self-view. He says, look in verses 6 and 7. This is part of his prayer. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you, have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Now, Nehemiah is very open here. And if you think about it, the reason for that is because he hears the news, and he did not realize how bad it was in Jerusalem. Maybe he just didn't think of it. But if he would have thought of it, maybe he would have realized that there's no way they could have built those walls back up. They didn't have the resources, the manpower. It had to be done by him from decree of the king to go there with resources to make sure that everything was done appropriately. But he maybe didn't realize that. But it hit him, and he realized that the reason those walls were still down was because of sins in his life and in the life of the people around him. He was taking personal responsibility for the fact that those walls were down. Not just him, but he was part of that. This is how we recognize the proper view of ourselves. And it's easy for us to get haughty and think, I'm so much better than I am, right? It's easy for us to forget that we have flaws, that there are things in our life that we have done that may be causing situations that we're in. And sometimes we're too hard on ourselves, but sometimes we ignore those things that we see. And so we have to have a proper understanding of who we are. And the only way we can do that is to see ourselves clearly in light of who God is. And when we do that, we have the humility to continue on the way He wants us to. We also need to have the proper memory. If you look in verses 8 and 9, it says, "Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name." He's asking God to remember what He had promised. He said, I recognize. Now He's bringing to his own mind remembering. He's remembering, intentionally remembering, and talking to God about this, because he's saying, listen, we recognize that you told us if we were doing evil that you would spread us out all over the world in punishment. But we also remember that you said you'd bring us back, and this is what I'm asking you to do. Please bring it back. Bring us back. It's important for us to remember such things, to remember the promises that God made to us, so that we can call on Him to fulfill those promises. Now, it's not that God wouldn't fulfill the promises if we didn't ask, but there's an interesting idea that we have several passages discussing. James chapter 1 is one of them. He says in verses 2 through 5 that if we lack wisdom, that we should ask of God. Well, the implication seems to be, if you want wisdom, ask for it. Well, the reverse of that would be then, if I don't ask for it, I may not get it. So there are blessings, there are things that God has in reserve for us to help us along in our journey that we must ask for if we intend to get it. It may just be because, for example, with wisdom, if you don't seek wisdom, you won't find wisdom. Well, that's the way wisdom works. And so there are things that we ask God for that we need to remember to ask God for, and His faithfulness He will provide for us. But if we don't think to ask, maybe we won't get those things that He's promised. So many conditional promises that have been given to us. Forgiveness is one of those as well. if we don't intentionally seek forgiveness from God, it's not going to be provided for us. Isn't that what Jesus meant when he said, seek and you'll find? Knock and the door will be open to you? So many things about God's Word relate to the fact that we've got to be looking for it. So vision implies that we have a good memory so we know where we're going forward. And this will help us, and we get into the Word, it'll help us to see where we're going, hopefully, in a better way. Another one is the last one, or the second to last one, is the proper request. It is, we need to ask for the right things. In verse 10, he says, now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant, to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. So we have the requests that we need to make known to God. This helps you to see, to refine the vision that you need to have. So we're looking at a goal, we're looking at a place we want to be. We remember what God tells us that we should be doing and that He's going to help us to do. And so it encourages us to look forward, and we're asking for help. And this helps to refine our idea of what we're trying to accomplish. And we need to be as specific as we can be. The more specific we are in identifying the places we're going and the goals that we're trying to reach, the more specific we are, the more likelihood it is that we're going to be able to reach them. But if it's just a vague idea, we're not going to have as much of a way to get there. An example of this is the prayer that we might pray sometimes, Lord, make me a better Christian. There's nothing wrong with that idea. I want to be a better Christian. But what does that mean? It might mean something for you that it doesn't mean for me, and vice versa. So if we can be specific in asking God, please make me a better Christian. Maybe it's make me have a better understanding of other people. Maybe it's let me have more patience in my life. Maybe it's let me develop the fruit of the Spirit in general. Whatever it is, the more specific we can be, the more vision we're going to have about how we're going to achieve those things. And it's really amazing when you actually identify what you're trying to accomplish, and if you're very specific about what you're trying to accomplish, God has made our brains so that it will automatically start working it out, trying to figure out, okay, how can I get there? You're going to come up with all kinds of ideas of steps that you can take to get there. So the more specific you can be, the more your brain is going to be helping you, and I believe this is what God did for us. He helped us to do that. And we can see specifically what He was praying for as well. And then the proper attitude. And if you look at the last part of this verse, it says, in verse 11, it says, I was the king's cupbearer. Why would He put that in there? I think it's because He recognized that He was in a place, in a position where He could actually do something that maybe other people couldn't. He had access to the most powerful person on the planet at that time, or at least in that general region. He had access to someone who he could eventually, hopefully, ask for help to have exactly what actually did happen, to go back to his homeland and rebuild the walls. This is something that he recognized. I think it would be why he said this, to give us an indication that, oh, hey, there's something I can do about this. And we have the right attitude of looking at our strengths, at our opportunities, and the things that we can do. And I recognize there's things in my life that I want to change that I can't do anything about. I'm powerless to do anything about. I know that God can do things, but I'm powerless. Have you ever had those situations? But there are things in my life that I can do something about, and I need to make sure that I'm working toward that in the best way that I can. And I think one of the keys to that is to have the attitude that, okay, there is something that I can do, and I intend to use that to the glory of God. If we can do those kinds of things, even if they're small things, it is amazing how God can take a small thing and use it to do big things, right? We have many, many examples in the Bible of just that. So we have to develop the vision, having all these different attributes. I hope this has been a little bit of help for you and encouragement of what you can do to refine your vision. You need vision in your life. We need our leaders, we need our elders to tell us and give us, paint a picture of where we're going in vision, but you also need that for your own life, because they're not going to sit down with each individual person and say, hey, this is where you need to go with your life. You have that responsibility yourself. And the way you're going to reach those places, one of the ways that you're going to do that is by having the right vision of knowing where you're going. I want to encourage you to set goals, to think about what you can do, what you can accomplish, be as specific as you can, having the right attitudes, having the right responses to the situations that you're facing, having the right outlook on life, and see reality for what it is. Well, if you need any help tonight, we want to offer the opportunity to pray with you, or anything else that you need. We're here for you. If you need to be baptized, I think everyone here is. We're here for you to do that too. If there's anything that you need, please just let us know, and please come as we stand and sing.